let's go ahead and start. Mike, we are glad to have you with us today. You're coming to us live from New Zealand, right?
Yes.
So tell us a little bit about what is life like in New Zealand these days? Ministry, your family. Tell us a little bit about yourself.
Yeah, man. Be glad to. Thanks for having me on, by the way. Great to meet you guys and get to hang out a little bit. Yeah, I mean, I'm from South Africa originally. So if you're wondering, I don't know if anyone listening to this would be familiar with the New Zealand accent, but this is not the New Zealand accent. So just to put that to rest. And then usually the next question I get is, well, what kind of accent is that? Because dang, it's weird. And that's true. It is weird. It's a weird accent, but it hails from South Africa. I'm born and raised in South Africa. And then when I was about 21, headed over to London and lived there for a while. And so then came back to South Africa. So I think I think I've hung out with a lot of Americans along the way, and a lot of Europeans and a lot of Canadians. And so the accent has just got weird. But when I was in South Africa, I became a Christian. So that was around when I was about 21, and I am 42 now, so a while ago. And I was going in a very different direction. That's a story on its own. But became a Christian, and very soon, I think, felt the call to ministry. So I was at a Baptist church there in South Africa, Port Elizabeth, for anyone who knows it. And, just quite a big church. They were prolific in their church planting. They planted some amazing amount of churches in Africa. So that's what I thought I was going to do. I thought, let's sign up, do seminary, just start gearing towards some sort of missionary work in Africa. And, just started that process. And eventually I started an internship with one of the lead pastors there, who eventually came on a church plant to New Zealand. And that was in 2004, 2005. And once I'd finished my internship with him, I took over as he went back and planted another church in South Africa. But I took over from him about 2007. And so I've been full-time since 2005, a year in Wellington. And so, yeah, we've just been plugging away. It's very different to the States. I've been over to the States a few times, so I kind of have a little bit of a gauge or reference. I would say that life here is a lot like, if anyone has ever been to some European city, or maybe very British influence in general. It's maybe a lot like Canada in terms of the evangelical Christian scene, and Quebec even. And so it's just that, it's definitely on the fringe. It's very secular, very liberal, very postmodern, very, very progressive in many ways. It's kind of funny. We often hear about things that I'll go over to the States and there'll be this big issue about something that's being allowed, or, something that's happening. And that is just so sanctified. Even just to be having those discussions are quite amazing, because it feels like you come back to Sodom and Gomorrah after that, because we've just gone way down that rabbit hole already, and we're not even having those kinds of discussions. So really, I feel like with New Zealand, you definitely have your work cut out for you. It's difficult to plant churches here. It's the upshot of all of that, though, is that when people do become Christians, when they do join a church, they mean business. Very little nominalism. It's all on at that point. So you can do amazing things with small churches, which is really cool. I've enjoyed that, because I think South Africa is a lot more like the States in that you have a cultural Christianity that's still there. And that used to drive me nuts, in hindsight. Just it's almost like all I was ever preaching about was, no, you're not a real Christian. This is what a real Christian is. And I don't have to do that anymore, ever. I just, if someone's at church, they're not getting any points from any social anything. So it's all business for them. So it's been great. It's been a real joy to pastor a church. Our church is just under 100. So it's I think I'd say I wouldn't say it's a small church, but in New Zealand, that's okay. That's not doing too bad at all. and it's really just a healthy little witness in the city here in Wellington. We're right in the inner city, and Wellington is a little bit like I always describe it like if you can imagine, so San Francisco and Portland having a baby, that would be Wellington. You know, I think that's the way to put it. Having been to those cities, it's a mixture of those. Very, very. It's the political capital of New Zealand. Well, it is the capital, but it's where all the politics happens, where all the the universities are, and the art students, and all the artsy stuff, and very. It's kind of the hub of all the progressive anything in New Zealand. So it's definitely a good place to be, to plant a church in. But definitely Wellington needs Jesus for sure. And that said, it's definitely it's difficult, And then you swim upstream, not only on the issue of Christianity, but being Reformed, confessional Baptist. My goodness, that's like a drop in the ocean, within a drop in the ocean. And so a lot of it is just the idea of conservative values and that sort of thing are very difficult to get people to embrace in general. And so conservative doctrine is, it's rare. And I think a lot of the conservative churches tend to be small and parochialized. As a result, they tend to get hard shelled and kind of withdraw into themselves, because it's difficult. It's difficult to believe what we believe in this basic climate and culture. So you kind of have this posture of self-protection and, just get away from me. And I'm just going to, the churches tend to be small and inward looking in that sense. So we've worked hard not to let that happen and to, keep ourselves open and engage with what's all around us. And not easy though. But there we go. There's a little nutshell. More we could say. I could start monologuing if I'm not careful. So let me pull back at this point.
No, that's okay. That's interesting for us. We always like to point our listeners to resources. You do some podcasting.
Yeah.
You want to tell us a little bit about your podcast?
Yeah, sure. We
can find that information.
Totally. Yeah. You can get onto 2hsojourner.com. That's 2h sojourner, all one word. And we started that a while back. It's just 3 pastors in New Zealand, and sometimes a guy from California, Chris Kahi. You might know him from the Meredith Klein group or the Glory Cloud podcast. We hosted a conference a while back. He was a speaker. We kind of got in touch and just thought we could kick something off. We're major Klein fans. I've just I've continued my studying through the South African university that we started with. So I'm doing my PhD on Klein now, sort of just a little bit over halfway on that, and just looking at Klein and his covenant theology and the 2 kingdoms, and how the one supports the other and so forth. And that's another topic. If anyone is interested on that, and I will just direct them to Glory Cloud, because we just did a whole thing about that. If you should be able to find it fairly easy. But in terms of our own podcast, we wanted to, because they were going through Klein's material, just moving through his books, and we just wanted to broaden that out a little bit. Let it play around with Baptist theology as well, and see how Klein's covenant theology works with certainly a lot of Baptistic thinking, but even just beyond that, just life in the 2 ages. Just that was the big idea, just to kind of apply Klein just in general conversation, and we do it anyway. I'd phone these pastors. The one guy is my brother in the UK. The other guy is another pastor in New Zealand. Much like yourselves, we just kind of talk it out. And we thought, well, let's just put it online if anyone else cares. And yeah, it's done well. It's been it's got a little niche, and I think it's worthwhile. Just we enjoy it. So if we can make the world a more Kleinian place, then we've done our job.
Okay, good.
And then if anyone wants to check out GraceNet, the church I pastor, that's gracenet.co.nz, or Z, as you guys say. But Z. Let's leave it at Z, the way you're supposed to say it.
Yeah. Listening to your podcast, you guys seem to interact with American theology a lot. How important is what's coming out of the States to you guys?
Oh, yeah. Look, that's a big question, actually. There's a lot coming out of the States, and I suppose what we interact with is right there in the bullseye of what we're interested in. I think in terms of New Zealand, probably what comes out of the States is not as influential as perhaps it's, again, the British influence thing. The stuff that's really influencing us on the ground here, I think, from the States is probably via the Hillsong thing, which is maybe the American prosperity gospel deal that's kind of moved, in this way. So in terms of the kinds of stuff we deal with, and not much by way of actually interacting with New Zealand. Same thing. I'm part of the Fellowship of Reformed Baptists in New Zealand, so that's our church association, and I think there again you have a very strong British influence. It's Banner of Truth, and a lot of the guys are from the UK and so forth. But I think for us personally, yeah, the States have been huge. And when I say the States, I mean like Escondido, Westminster, California. Van Drunen, Horton, Klein. Those guys are very influential to us. I think certainly that's my whole kind of wheelhouse right now anyway, and so that's why it comes through on the podcast for sure. Right now we're interacting with Fesco's book on baptism. I don't know if you guys have taken a look at it, but Word, Water, and Spirit, great book.
Yeah, it sounds good. When we we wanted to talk about covenant theology, specifically Baptist covenant theology. Maybe take a moment. Can you explain to us maybe what covenant theology is? A lot of our listeners are farmers. They might be out on a combine right now. Listening on a combine. Just kind of, what is covenant theology? What is Baptist covenant theology?
Well, covenant theology is, maybe the way to approach it. One of the things that's been helpful to me is just to see a difference between covenant theology and federal theology, and I think that might come into play as we talk further about things like 1689 federalism and so forth. But essentially, you've got this covenant theology is just you read about the covenants in the Bible, and it's just a way of putting all that together. It's the Bible's own rubric for understanding itself. It's the Bible's own hermeneutic. And so in some ways, everyone must have a covenant theology of sorts. I think that's probably important to say, because those exegetical covenants are there for anyone who needs to read the Bible. But when we think about federalism and the idea of a covenant theology as a systematic construct, there you're looking at a fairly standard trifold scheme, as they call it, the trifold schema or bifold schema or something, where you've got the covenants of redemption in eternity, otherwise known as the pactum salutis in Latin. You've got the foedus operum, the covenant of works that happened in the garden, and again, a lot of it is a theological sort of construct at that point, based on the whole Bible together. And then you've got the covenant of grace, which moves from the point of the fall all the way through to the new covenant. And those three covenants are a way of speaking about all of the covenants and what they're doing theologically. You start in eternity. You start before time itself, before creation. This is all coming out of God's mind, his plan, everything. It's a very Calvinistic sort of association at that point. It's all been planned. You have the covenant of works take place as a kind of almost a way to make the rest of the story legible in Adam's failure. In Adam's failure to work, to enter into, it's almost like God makes the world and enters into Sabbath, and man is created in the image of God and says, right, now come to me, essentially. Do what I did, work and enter into rest. And we know Adam failed to do that. And so the whole goal of the creation, where man was supposed to enter into rest with God and all eternity with him, has failed. And so this provides the context and the legibility for everything we see from that point on in the Bible, which is all under the rubric of the covenant of grace, which is, I think it was, I can't remember exactly who said this. It was one of the guys at Westminster. I think it might have been Godfrey. I like what he said about the covenant of grace. He said sometimes it's best just to leave that word "of" out. just go with covenant grace. And then immediately you get rid of all the debates and all the squabbles about what is and what isn't the covenant of grace. And you really, anyone who reads the Bible will know from Genesis 3:15 onwards, you've got a covenant grace there. You've got something that God has promised to do and is covenanting to do. If it's not clear there, it'll become clear later, but it eventually becomes very clear by the time you get to Jesus that this was the plan all along. He's the last Adam. He's the one who succeeds where Adam failed. And so we do enter into that reality of Sabbath glory, and even the eighth day, as Klein often speaks about, the thing that circumcision pointed to, the thing that new creation, that beginning of eternity, not just the end of the old creation, but the beginning of the new creation. And so I think that's a good way to kind of start thinking about. If anyone, I always talk about it that way to anyone that's looking into these things, just in the broadest possible sense. That's all covenant theology is trying to do, as a system, as a biblical theology, just wrestling through those exegetical covenants. Everyone's got to do that. So you don't have an option, of being that kind of covenant theologian. Everyone has to wrestle through that biblical theological angle to arrive at the system. And being Baptist, I mean, that's a real, I don't know. Sometimes I really don't even know that I am a Baptist, to be honest. I mean, we are Reformed Baptists, but if I think we've got the Baptist Union, and we've got things like the General Baptists and the Independent Baptists, and I think we're joined with them on the fact that we dunk people, and that's about it. So I don't even know that that's a real point to be united on at that greater level. Really, I think of myself more as Reformed, but taking exception on the issue of infant baptism. I think that's the whole deal with the 1689. That's how it came about historically. And certainly as I talk to Presbyterian brothers or Reformed brothers, I just feel immediately there is a total connection there, and those are the guys I feel I kind of agree with really almost completely, with except for this issue of baptism. So I don't know that I can speak into what it means to be a Baptist really, but yeah, I can certainly talk about what it means to take exception on the issue of infant baptism. So that's kind of my world at this point. And so covenant theology is important to me, and obviously the one thing that is relevant in terms of being Baptist and holding to covenant theology is that often it's thought that you can't really hold to a true Reformed covenant theology and end up a Baptist, and of course I think it's exactly the opposite. So that's a whole discussion on its own. But I think if you are careful with covenant theology, it must lead you to a Baptist position. I'm convinced of that.
That's helpful. Yeah.
Tell I'm making Presbyterian friends already.
Right. It's one thing we say with holding to a confession. We have great unity with someone even far away, like you. We don't know each other very well, but we hold to the confession. So there's immediately a great
Amen.
unity.
Amen.
But amongst Reformed Baptists, there is intramural debate on covenant theology a little bit. Can you articulate a little bit what that is, 1689 federalism in particular? If there's a different option, I don't know if there's 6 views.
Yeah.
I don't know, but
well, yeah. I mean, I suppose as you start looking at these things, you realize, oh my goodness, there are actually a whole bunch of views, and it just keeps on fracturing. The closer you get, it's like a microscope thing. But in general, just to keep it, at its broadest possible level, I think there is, as I think about the 1689 confessional unity that you've just spoken about, and compare it to, let's say, the Westminster confessional unity, I mean, really, there's no difference. 1689 confessional unity, yeah, you have a little squabble here and there, but we're all basically on the same page. Like, I mean, it's just, there's a wonderful solidarity about it. Sure, the one guy's going to be a little bit more into covenant theology than the next guy, and the other guy's going to kind of nuance this point, but we're all basically in that kind of two kingdom realm. We're all basically, no one's going to be a theonomist as a Baptist. We've already taken care of the church and state thing. We're all basically, a very similar view of the church and a very similar view of the way it all works in terms of a progressive unfolding of redemptive revelation. very different to the Westminster kind of unity, because there they can all hold to the Westminster Confession, and you have some people who are theonomists and other who are Kleinians. I mean, those two are as far apart as you can imagine, and yet they both fight for the same confession. So, there's a good example of the kind of difference you would find in that camp. So I feel like anything we say about different views within the those who hold to a 1689 confession is really very minimal. So we just have to say that by way of preface. But that said, there is, I think, and I am sorry, I keep on bumping this thing. I hope it's not coming through. I can't hear myself, but it's going like dong, dong, dong as I hit the mic here. So one of the things that's happened fairly recently is what is called 1689 federalism, and I know I was around, from the dawn of that, where we actually had Jim Renihan, who's Sam Renihan's father, came down to New Zealand regularly. He's actually taught all his courses that he taught in Westminster Seminary when he was still there. He taught them down here in New Zealand as well. So I've had the great privilege, and I do consider it a great privilege of sitting under that, because greatly benefited by it. But he taught us through the confession and very carefully, and his son Sam Renihan and Pascal Denard and a few others have been looking into, and they've just always been very interested in the history of the whole thing. And it's, they are the pioneers by way of what the framers of the confession were thinking and the kinds of theology they were putting out. So really, those guys are all the go-to guys. They're putting out all the go-to resources on that stuff. And they have, I think, rightly uncovered, especially Pascal's master's thesis, uncovered that, it's probably the case that when they framed the 1689, the majority view at that time was a very distinctive kind of covenant theology, and it's what they want to try and revive, just because it's really been largely absent. As Reformed Baptist confessional theology has kind of come back into place, it's almost borrowed from the Westminster and all the resources of the Westminster Confession, even by way of current Presbyterian and Reformed theologians, and it's kind of baptized it, and then turned it into what we hold to. But I think what's so appealing to them, I mean, leaving aside, obviously, it's they would argue it's biblical as well. But it's just this idea that it's just exciting, that we have this confessional heritage, and that these guys had worked it out to this level, and they want to try and bring it back and put it on the map, and they've done a great job of it. And I've really appreciated everything they've said about it. And Sam actually, just before he because that was his doctoral thesis or dissertation that he just before he published it, or just before he got his doctorate, he came down and took us through the whole thing. And so we went through the whole thing piece by piece, and it was great. So I got to talk to him about all the little nuances there, and I feel like that was a very helpful time for me personally. Even though I have differences, I know exactly where those shades are, and I might not have just from seeing what I've seen on the internet from that point on. But so that's kind of been their thing. I think if there is another group, it's not as focused. It's not as focused in terms of its aim, but really the way to describe it, I suppose, is more or less 1689 federalism and more Reformed Baptist covenant theology. That's the way I'm just trying to get to a more broad understanding of covenant theology, and maybe a greater joining in with the Reformed idea, with the Reformed project on covenant theology. So perhaps that's why I want to keep that word there, because there's probably a greater leaning on, well, that's great that we've got the 1689 confession and the framers and what they thought, but let's move on from that and just join the conversation with what's happening by way of cutting edge Reformed and covenant theology, and let's see what can be incorporated and improved upon. And so I think that's a lot of what's happening in the other side of it, along with what they call the 20th century Reformed Baptist view, which is basically, as I said earlier, it's just those who inherited their covenant theology from the Westminster kind of oriented crowd. And so, I put that all in that same bucket, though. We're all just trying to work it out, and are not particularly bent on recovering that historical form. Don't deny it's there, but it's just, the fact that it existed in history is not the most appealing thing for me. I want to know more. I want to use that as a starting point and dive in and see if that was right, or if it can be fine-tuned. Or I think even the Westminster side has come a long way since the Westminster Confession. Voss and Ridderbos and all these major theologians that have brought a whole new dynamic that John Owen was only starting to touch on at that point. Meredith Klein, definitely. This all needs to be brought into our thinking on covenant theology, certainly by way of context, ancient Near Eastern stuff. So for me, it's like, you've got to bring that in. You've got to make sure that that's informing your covenant theology. And I don't want to make it sound like that's without historical precedent, because that would, I think, one of the guys I cut my teeth on, and one of the guys I most appreciate in the tradition is John Gill, who was probably the greatest systematic theologian of the tradition, I think, in terms of at least what he wrote, the amount that he wrote. But what I like about John Gill is that not so much that I agree with every point, but there was a guy who clearly, he almost reminds me of a kind of earlier Meredith Klein, in the sense that he wasn't too concerned to stay within the rigid boundaries that anyone had set up. He was, or parochializing the Baptist camp. He was bringing in John Owen. He was bringing in Herman Vitzius. He was engaging with all of those guys and trying to work it into a Baptist rubric. And so I really appreciate the way he tries to do that in his double volume, and that's worth looking at if anyone hasn't looked at that already. But then, of course, you've got things like Bunyan, and I know a lot of people don't like Bunyan because he's not a real Reformed Baptist, because he had this kind of different view here and there. Well, I like Bunyan, and I think he's in my bigger camp. He's in my Reformed covenant theology camp. Maybe not 1689 Federalist, but I think he should be part of the whole deal. And I appreciate what he's tried to work at getting, especially around those more ecumenical bits. I've appreciated that. And then all the way through to Spurgeon and Pink and so forth. You could keep going. R.C. Howell is another one. And then, I suppose even Renihan does mention guys like Cheer and Steed and Ryder and those guys at the time of the framing of the confession, who held to different views. They didn't hold to a 1689 federal view. So there is diversity represented in the history as well. And Sam's the first one to admit that. He does say that the confession itself does not lock you down to a 1689 Federalist position. That's an important point, I think. It's just that it makes room for that and a slightly broader position, and that's the glory of the confession. It keeps us united despite our differences. So there's more to say about that, but hopefully that's I don't want to inundate with information. That's hopefully something that just gets you onto the map.
Yeah. If somebody was just wanting to just start getting into some of this, they're just saying, okay, covenant theology, I see this. Where would a person start?
Wow, that's a great question. My favorite book right now on covenant theology, I mean, it tends to change a little bit. If you talk to me in a year's time, it might be a new book. But right now, I recommend two things that neither of them are Baptist books, but I don't see, it imbibes Baptist thinking in the best way. When you think about the Presbyterian side and the Reformed side, you can get covenant theologies that are set up from that ground level that will lead you to pedobaptism, and it's an unavoidable conclusion. But there are other covenant theologies, even within the pedobaptist camp, Klein being one of them, I think, that really, if it doesn't lead you straight to being a Baptist, which is what I think, it's almost like Owen, John Owen, and the way he will kind of really leave the question open in many ways. Even though he himself was a pedobaptist, it gets you thinking in ways that are very Baptistic, ultimately. So for that reason, I recommend Michael Brown's Sacred Bond as an intro to covenant theology. I love that book as an intro. I think it's great. I think you do need to move on from that. It's not all that can be said about covenant theology, but anyone who's just starting cold, and wants to just check it out and try and think through the whole dynamic from a systematic theological perspective, I think that is a great book. And then the other one is kind of maybe I'm just prone towards this right now because of where I'm at, with my personal studies and so forth. But I think David Van Drunen's Living in God's Two Kingdoms, the first half of that book, before he gets into the two kingdoms side, he sets it's great because it's already a small book, so it's not very intimidating. And then you could take half of that book, which is like a super small book, and that's like a beautiful intro to covenant theology right there. And then you get to add a bonus of two kingdom theology, which I love. So I think anyone who wants to start out can look at that as well. Then in terms of the way, there are some very helpful books. Sam Renihan's book, for example, is a great intro to covenant theology, but it's a much more heady read, and obviously he's gunning for a certain thing there. Pascal Deneu's book, is good in that it introduces that historic form that I was talking about. All of them are great books, but it's I'd say go on to those afterwards. Settle or cut your teeth on those really great intro works. Another one I should mention as well. I used to put this before I came across Michael Brown's book. Chris Kahi's book, The Tale of Two Adams, is also, I've just found, fantastic for introducing people to covenant theology. It deals with all the main issues, I think, well. And I've actually had an opportunity to teach through his book in India. And, it was a similar sort of situation where people just had no idea of what covenant theology was, but there were good theological students. And I used that as the textbook, and it worked very well. So, and you can actually get that for free as well, The Tale of Two Adams, or you can get it all on Kindle. So those would be my recommendations to start out.
Is there a country you haven't been in?
Oh, I'm definitely starting to get up the badges. I mean, I think I haven't been to China or anywhere there, weirdly enough. I feel like I've missed out on China somehow, and China and Japan, although those are kind of close by to where I'm at now. So I'm kind of waiting. That's the last bastion for me.
Yeah. All right, John, I'm waiting for you to ask a question.
Hey, I'm just taking it in today. I'm just learning.
Come on, John. Yeah. Ask the question. We're waiting.
I was listening.
Yeah, one of the comments that I usually get when you talk about covenant theology is immediately people's minds go right to infant baptism. Yeah. And just those two things are associated with one another. And you've made the comment a couple times that really covenant theology doesn't drive you to paedobaptism, but can you kind of flesh that out a little bit, maybe?
Oh yeah, totally. I mean, I think that it's certainly it's the only thing you have to make the argument for paedobaptism plausible. I mean, without covenant theology, how would you even argue? I mean, you got maybe a Roman Catholic sacerdotalism, and maybe there's the Lutheran angle, but to stay Reformed and Protestant and so forth, and yet retain the practice of infant baptism, which I mean, I don't think it's really. Yeah, it's hard to deny that in history it's always had a very sacerdotal kind of connotation. They were doing something when they baptized infants, and it wasn't what the Reformed are doing now. And so certainly you can understand how how that as the Reformers went to start thinking about this whole issue in light of the Anabaptist complaints and so forth. You can appreciate that this is the only possible way for them to kind of stay Protestant and yet hold on to that. And even though I end up disagreeing with where they get to, you've got to appreciate, it's almost like everything else in church history and God's providence and various trials that come along and heresies and so forth. The thing that comes out, the struggle that comes out of that is what's so valuable. It ends up, the question of why on earth should we baptize infants, has yielded such fruitful biblical study, even if it's, among some, in my opinion, led to wrong conclusions. it's been amazing. It's sent them back into really consideration of what we were talking about earlier, this historical unfolding of God's plan of redemption. Initially there was this, okay, well, look how it's all one plan. And so if they were circumcising their kids, let's baptize our kids, and it's all one covenant of grace. And you can see how that would be a very logical way to look at that. And then even, as I think about the 1689 history, because you had all of that come out of the Puritan history, really. And the thing with the Puritans was that they were Anglicans, essentially, that were, just really hoping for more of a Reformation to come to England. And it, it didn't happen, and it just ended up looking like a real mix between Rome and anything Protestant. And so they were called Puritans because they wanted more purity in the church. It was a derogatory term. And then some tried to stay and work it out in the system. Others wanted to leave. And they did. Then they started the congregational churches and Presbyterian churches and so forth. But then the issue was that you needed to know what to do with your kids, because you would get your papers. You'd be born, you'd be baptized in the institutional church. This is how you got your, I don't know, the equivalent of your green card or your passport or something. So there would be every initiative to be baptized just for those church and state matters. But when you've broken for theological reasons from this institutional situation, and you're starting these independent congregational churches out of your conviction of the Reformation, and yet you're still baptizing your kids, you're leaning only on Scripture at that point. It's not for any other benefit, and especially because the only ones that were able to legitimately baptize were the Anglicans. They had to process all of this. So you just start seeing how this conversation starts developing, and even that leads to this very fruitful examination of how these covenants fit together and how they unfold. And maybe it's not quite as flat as we thought, and maybe there's something else going on. And why does the New Testament not reinstate the whole thing explicitly, and what's going on there? And so they had to work through all of that. And eventually I think this is where out of that congregationalist setting, you had the Reformed Baptists come along, the particular Baptists as they were called then. And, they're parting with tears in their eyes. They don't want to part from their brothers. And that's why they're writing this confession to show this great unity. They don't see themselves so much as part of the Anabaptist continent thing, but more just a breakaway group within the Reformed situation there, and completely united on every point except for this issue, because of the covenant theology, because of the way that the covenant theology itself has moved them to deny infant baptism. So I think just historically you can see how that unfolds. But for me, I think one of the big issues is that you've got, what we often say is, you've got a parallel between circumcision and baptism, but not a parity on every issue. Where circumcision points forward typologically, baptism will look back in a fulfillment of an event already happened. So there's an administrative difference there, where circumcision was applied to Abraham's physical children, baptism was applied to Abraham's spiritual children, you might say, or even just God's children in Christ. That's the progeny there, where circumcision concerned a physical lineage, and a people of the old creation, you might say. Baptism concerns a spiritual people with the new creation in mind, where circumcision includes infants, and those infants are charged to believe as they wait for the Messiah. But really, it's the very opposite with baptism. It includes those who have already believed and therefore become part of that group, where circumcision is administered as a kind of part of the 7-day worship idea. In other words, it's waiting for the fulfillment of the Sabbath. It's part of that system. Baptism, I think, does it exactly the other way around. It's an 8th-day reality. It's what circumcision only pointed to, and it talks about this new creation that has already been something entered into. Jesus has already brought us into rest, and we're already part of this new creation. The already not yet. We've already been baptized by the Spirit at Pentecost, and so now we live in this inauguration of the new age. And so things like that change the game completely, where circumcision was waiting for the bloody sacrificial rite, the tearing away of the body of the flesh, which all pointed to the cross. Baptism, points to something that has now historically happened, coming back to that first point again. So I think, for me, all of those things have been informed by biblical theology. That you can't flatten that out if you really get a good grasp of what's happening. It's pointing to, it's happened, and now the administration of the covenant of grace in the new covenant is of different kilter in that sense. It's an administration of fulfillment, even though it's not already in the new creation at its consummated level. Administratively, it makes it it points toward that reality that has now been fulfilled. So I think for me, that's one of the reasons I land the way I do there. And obviously there's way more to say, and it's one of the reasons I'm a little bit different. Some of the stuff I've mentioned there is I think why I'm a little bit different to a Westminster covenant theology and also a 1689 Federalist covenant theology. So, both of those things come into play. I mean, I'm not sure how much you want to talk about that, but yeah, might be worth just mentioning in case anyone's listening to this.
So I do have a question, Mike. So
now it's going to get interesting. I'm ready.
Yeah, this is a really hard one.
You guys can tell that you're the strong, silent type.
Well, say we have a listener that doesn't know if they're saved or not. How can a person be right with God?
Yeah. Oh, wow. Amen. If they're listening to this and me talking about circumcision and baptism, especially, I would send them to Ephesians, because what I love about what Ephesians does. It starts off with this covenant theology, essentially, this pactum salutis, this eternal reality. Here we are, chosen before the foundation of the world. You've read the beginning of Ephesians. It's amazing. It's the sublime piece of theology that it's hard to even fathom what's going on there. But you get caught up in the moment. You realize this is a big plan in God. And then he says, like Paul goes, okay, here's what's going on theologically with the church. This is what's true of the new covenant. This is the whole big eternal plan of God now come to its fruition. And then he goes, now here's how it applies to you. And he says, I rejoice over you because of the sealing of the Spirit that I can observe, which I think is an amazing idea. In other words, he says, I'm able to rejoice that all the things I'm talking about are true of you because of your faith. I can see your faith and your love for the saints, and these things cause me to rejoice that this entire plan of God is definitely true of you. You're wrapped up into it. And he uses this idea of a seal, which this is big language in covenant theology as well, the sign and seal of the covenant of grace. Maybe a great way to bring out the progression element too, because, when you were in the Old Testament or in the Abrahamic covenant or Mosaic covenant, you had a sign in circumcision that pointed to the cross, pointed to what needed to be done. That's why it's a sign. It was a seal because it like an emperor's ring that sealed upon wax, and guaranteed something. It proved to you that you were part of a physical people, Israel, that would inherit these promises in the land. And this was, this was proof that you were part of this covenant by birth and so forth. It acted as a seal. Now, Paul says we are the fulfillment of that circumcision. The seal has the same reality of God's validation has now happened in the new covenant. The Holy Spirit's working upon our heart, bringing us to faith. So if you he says you were dead in your trespasses and sins. You hated Jesus. You were walking around like a zombie and marching towards certain destruction. There was nothing in you that could have loved Jesus and loved the saints and believed. And yet now, all of a sudden, here you are experiencing a glimpse of what is yet to come in the new creation. Here you are hanging out with other Christians on Sunday, worshiping Jesus as amongst zombies, essentially. And it's like, obviously, a new creation reality has dawned in you. You're experiencing what is going to come eternally. And this is a down payment for you. And so he gets them to simply look at, to not overlook that reality of faith. If they love Jesus, if they have trusted in him, if they have forsaken their works and held upon him for their salvation, they should not overlook this as something that should give joy and assurance, because it just can't happen without the Spirit having brought about the promises of the new covenant. The true circumcision has happened in regeneration of the heart, and that is a seal, just as circumcision was, except it's not to do with the land anymore in Palestine. It's to do with the whole creation, and that we will inherit the earth because of what Jesus has done. He is the great patriarch. He is the one who has come and promised to Abraham, and we're his seed. We're his offspring. And so, that's, I think, the best place that anyone who wants to know how to be saved and also be assured of their salvation can go and look. Just that opening chapter of Ephesians, and maybe a little bit into chapter 2. So, if I fail, I know Paul won't. I'll send them there.
There you go. Thanks.
That's good. That's good. Well, we just want to thank you so much for spending some time with us today and helping
Absolutely.
us out with this.
No worries. It's been a pleasure. Great to know about you guys. I'll make sure to keep listening.
Well, yeah, thanks. We really appreciate you. We'll put links to your things in our description, and your podcast and what you're involved in, and thanks for the recommendations on books. We just
Pleasure. Great.
appreciate that. So
Awesome.